Welcome to the Boundaries podcast with Jennifer and Dr. P. We want to ask if you would please like, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. We just want to trigger that darn algorithm. And if you will do that, then we can bring you more content.
And don't forget, please pay attention to that disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast. Thank you. We'll see you soon. Hello, and welcome to the Boundaries podcast with Jennifer and Dr. P. This is our introductory episode. I am a licensed physician, and the information in this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. I am your host, Dr. Pocurull, and this is my lovely co-host, Jennifer, and Trinity is our other co-host.
Hello, my name is Jennifer, and I want to tell you our credo, why we're doing this. We believe in self-care and the foundation of boundaries. Self-care with boundaries leads to a healthier mind, body, and soul. This leads to healthier relationships, thus a more fulfilling life. And that's a beautiful thing. A beautiful life leads to a higher power.
So Trinity lets us know her displeasure when we're not performing to her standards. So, okay, so why are we doing this, and how do we get started on boundaries? I think one of the things that we were talking about before is how especially in today's age, boundaries get thrown around left and right, and I think most of the time people don't understand how complicated boundaries really are. I mean, we were planning this podcast, and we had several episodes just on boundaries alone, and then just extensions on boundaries. So do you want to talk a little bit more about what you had in mind?
Yes. Well, we can really share with you a lot of the secrets of boundaries. We've got dozens and dozens of episodes that we have planned for the future. Boundaries come into our life during all kinds of situations, like at work, with your boss, and your boss is kind of being rude or extra hard on you. We're going to go over things like that, like what are boundary violations? Sometimes we feel bad about something, but it's more about us than it is about that person. And we'll get angry, like I might get angry at my husband thinking, you did something wrong. Like, I don't like it that you leave the toothpaste cap off all the time. But that's really more about me. You're not required to be a super clean, meticulous person.
Even if I am, I'm not required to be.
Yes. So that's more about me and what I can handle in my life. So, and we're also going to go over ways of negotiating those boundaries, like, talking to my husband about, what, I really whack myself out when you leave the tip of the cap of the toothpaste off, and it drives me nuts, and then I work myself into a frenzy and get a headache. And so then he has a choice, does he love me enough to care about the fact that I get a headache over it, or is that really just too inconvenient for him to, start putting that cap back on the toothpaste?
And like a good husband, what I do is I get toothpaste that doesn't require to be capped.
That's right.
So it comes in a pump, so it makes my life easier and stops driving you nuts. So on that, I think that's an important, we just got into a discussion about negotiation, and in a seemingly simple topic, but as we learn to work with other couples, and I think that's
and ourselves,
but I think one of the reasons we're doing this is because as we were working with other couples, and we were also seeking the help of other couples, we heard a number of times, when are you going to write a book? And this was about, we're going on 15 years now. And we never got around to writing a book, and now we've decided to do this and just discuss what we've learned over the years, just not only with ourselves.
A correction, 16 years, dear.
16 years. Thank you. So not only with ourselves, but our work with other couples and what we've experienced or they have experienced with us. So one of the things about, as you were talking about boundaries and you were describing the episode of the toothpaste, boundaries is really more a system. That's not all it is, but it's a system of communication so that couples are able to interact in a way that we can learn where our boundaries are, what's a healthy boundary, what's not a healthy boundary, and how to navigate around that. Mm-hmm. So one of the elements you mentioned was asking, I don't remember how you put it, but you essentially expressed to me how it bothers you that I leave the toothpaste cap off. Mm-hmm. And if he loves me enough to address that. So one of the things that we notice couples often get into a power struggle over something like the toothpaste, the cap in the toothpaste, and the toothpaste cap. So that power struggle is often what results in resentment and bigger fights. It tends to explode. So
it adds up.
Yes, it builds.
Especially, if you're married for 5-10 years.
So without getting too much into what boundaries are, because that's going to be the topic of our second episode, is going into details defining boundaries and the types of boundaries that we have.
How they can make your marriage more enjoyable, healthy.
Practicing proper boundaries, yeah.
And boundaries are also, we learn to use boundaries with our children and teach our children how to use boundaries in relationships. Any relationship you're in, boundaries keep you safe and the other person safe from you offending them. They're a way of protecting yourself and keeping yourself reeled in, keeping that other person at bay.
So what you're talking about is not just, because we talked about couples, but there's boundaries are really relational for any kind of relationship. Mm-hmm. So our children, our extended family, your parents, my parents.
Your boss.
My boss, I'm the boss.
Well, yeah.
You mean people's bosses?
Yeah, if somebody has a boss. That's one of the biggest complaints that people have. The studies show that people take a lot of abuse from their boss.
Yeah. Now, just to clarify, I'm the boss at work.
And you're the best boss, right?
So, I was trying to say that you're the boss here, but
I am.
Okay. On that note, by the way, that's how we keep a happy marriage, is learning who's the boss where. So going back to boundaries, it is a relational tool, and we use it to, you mentioned a few things, protect ourselves, protect others from ourselves. We
protect our belongings.
So physical boundaries, that's another thing. When I was in school, we used to have a saying, we want to keep the honest people honest. When I was in high school, so we kept the lock on our lockers. And so that is an important boundary. People don't think about that. One other physical boundary that I brought up one time in a couples group was driving. The distance you keep from the car in front of you, that's a boundary. And people don't think about that, especially if you've had issues with growing up in a dysfunctional family. You really don't get a good grasp of where those boundaries are. So having these healthy boundaries does help us navigate the relationships more smoothly. It's not always easy. For example, having that difficult conversation about whatever it is has to be done with boundaries. It makes it healthy, but healthy is not always easy. right? So, for example, there's always conversation that people have to have with their parents about, with elderly parents. This is one thing I see is they don't want to give up their driving, and understandably so because of their freedom, but they can't see, they can't hear, they have difficulty with reflexes, and they have a hard time having that conversation with their parents. For example, the other thing is I deal with a lot of elderly people with osteoporosis and breaking their hips, and their children want to talk to them about living alone, being independent. That's a tough conversation to have.
Yeah.
And nobody's looking forward to that. So those are the kind of things that we discuss over time with boundaries. And each one of those particular scenarios is an entire discussion about boundaries in and of itself. So what were some of the other conversations that you think that we had to have around family?
Teenagers, they're gaining some freedom. So their boundaries are starting to get more permeable because they're allowed to stay out later at night. At least ours were. They've got their own car, and pretty soon my son will be able to drive himself. So one of the latest boundaries we sat with him was that for the next 6 months, we don't want him driving with friends in the car. We want him to be able to focus and not get distracted. So we set that boundary. If we're going to let you drive on your own and have that independence, these are the conditions. So those conditions were the boundaries we were setting for our son.
And of course, teenagers are going to be rebellious and they're going to push back and they're not going to like it.
Yeah.
And one of the discussions we had with him is that there is clearly research that shows that if you drive with passengers in your car, you're more likely to get into accidents as a teenager.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that teenagers, when they're in a group, for whatever reason, they get distracted and more likely, even though they have better reflexes than we do, they are more likely to get into an accident because of that, especially if it's somebody in the front seat. So the agreement we came up, and if you have a teenager trying to get his license, you may be going through this because they have to go through these classes, and you sign an agreement with them that they don't have a passenger in the car for the next 6 months, except preferably with his parents, and that there's serious consequences if that agreement's not met. And by the way, that brings us to yet another type of boundary, which is consequences. And having consequences is where the limits are. So we are going to talk about in future podcasts about boundaries with children, or what some experts call it limits. So setting limits on the children is important because children will test those limits. And if they don't see those consequences, they're not going to know that there's a limit there. They're just going to keep going. So that is another aspect of setting proper boundaries, is the consequences and violation of contracts, because the contract in a relationship is where you said, here are the boundaries, here are the consequences. So those are important.
I want to say that sometimes we set consequences on ourselves. Like, for instance, if you expected me home at a certain time so that we could go on a date, and I came home late, I have to set some consequences on you can't ground me or something like that. You can try, but that usually doesn't work. So I set consequences on myself, and it's more about being relational. So, for instance, I might do something to make up for it. So I might go and rub your feet for 30 minutes or something like that to be relational, or ask you, what can I do to make this up to you? It's not about just saying, oh, I'm sorry, or that wasn't my intention. That's a big no-no. That's so irritating when people say that.
Right, and the term for that, the term we use is amends, making amends. And as you can tell, that is also a term that is used in 12-step programs, which is something we'll talk about eventually in another podcast, where those terms come from. So you wanted to talk a little bit about how we got into this situation in the first place.
Yes. Well, Easter has always been a very symbolic date for us. It started on Easter Sunday of 2008, so about 16 years ago. And our marriage came to a crisis. We realized there was a big problem, and we sought out therapy. One of the biggest secrets to mending our relationship and bringing back the happiness, the love, the tenderness, the partnership where we help each other, and where we know where we can set limits on that help, requests, things like that. So that was it was quite a journey. But as painful as it was worth it. And then that brings us to Trinity. Wonderful things always happen to us on Easter. We found Trinity on Easter weekend this year. She is literally a junkyard dog. We found her in a junkyard, and she had a mangled...
No, hold on a second. What were, not we, what were you... doing in a young junkyard?
Well, my son, our son, our oldest son, he has a passion for cars, and his car is getting older. He's a college student, so he's a starving college student. But his car is getting older, and he wanted to find some parts for it. And so we were perusing some local junkyards. And on the way to one of the junkyards, we pulled up and just saw this poor little mangled dog with a mangled leg. And she was skinny as can be and had stuff all over her. She was a mess. And so took her to the vet. The vet had gone down the long list of all the problems she had, and then he said, euthanasia is not the wrong choice. And the weird thing is I had 3 dreams in the last month, in March. 3 dreams of a little red dog. And the last dream was a dog with a gimpy leg that I was walking. And I don't normally have dreams like that. And I thought back to those dreams, and I thought, you know what? This dog is meant to be. And since we found her on Easter, and she has 3 legs, we thought Trinity was the perfect name. So Trinity's here helping us with our boundaries
now,
today.
Those kind of dreams don't happen to me.
I know. They don't happen to me normally either.
I don't know about that. But it's... the thing about that dream is that you had mentioned about a week or so ago, you had mentioned that you had a dream about I can't remember how you worded it, but something about getting or finding a chihuahua or having a chihuahua. And you used the word chihuahua.
I said that a week ago?
Not a week ago, but a week or so before you found her.
Oh, before, yeah, that was the dog with the gimpy leg that I was walking. So that was the last dream that I had in that series of 3 dreams. So, 3 dreams, it's Easter, and then we got a dog with 3 legs.
So that's how Trinity, that's how Trinity joined our family. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so let's let's talk about why people should listen to us. wanted to say something about that.
Yes, so it's all about discovering who you are and who that other person is. Remember, boundaries are all about relationships. So you're discovering who you are. You're going to discover what are the situations you need to use boundaries in to protect yourself and others, when to use those boundaries, where and how to apply those boundaries. It's easy to say, oh, well, today I'm going to start enforcing my boundaries. What we've seen over and over is that people almost become abusive when they first start trying to apply their boundaries. So, the more you practice and the more we're going to teach you ways of, politely, diplomatically setting those boundaries. Sometimes you do need to be rude, but more than not, you want to set your boundaries. And when you're overly aggressive to people in situations that aren't necessary, then you're being boundaryless, and so we don't want that either. It's interesting how the pendulum swings from one extreme to the other. But you don't want to beat yourself up over that. For trying, you'll get better and better, and just like you would any other sport or practice that you might do. So my husband and I were literally made perfectly imperfect for each other. And that's the interesting thing about relationships. We seem to be drawn to people that are perfectly imperfect for us. But that's a call to action for us to learn to heal those wounds, heal those dysfunctions, and learn to set boundaries on ourselves and the other person, so that we can become a better person and more relational. Boundaries also really relieve a lot of suffering that sometimes we're not even conscious of until after we start setting those boundaries and we get this freedom. People start respecting us more. We start getting leadership positions. It was amazing how different I was as a small business owner after we learned how to set boundaries compared to when I had managed people in the past. There's a lot of wisdom to be gained in learning these boundaries. Honey, you want to go into all of the things that we did over the last 16 years? I know for me, I took 3 years of studying expressive arts, which is it's a therapeutic coaching process where through art I help people learn to express themselves, learn to set boundaries, learn to understand what their needs are around boundaries. And we also had worked with a lot of couples and coaching them around boundaries, read dozens of books. What have you done? What else have we done?
I'm sorry, Trinity's expressing herself
yes, I know.
while we're trying to talk. I don't know if the mic can pick her up, but she's
that's her making her weird noises.
So I think one of the things when we started is we were so I think we were both so broken at that point that we were willing to believe anything.
When we had the crisis.
Yeah. And we had to, we were so vulnerable, and that's one thing. People often have to be vulnerable. They don't know which direction to go to. Mm-hmm. And often when we feel vulnerable, we become more aggressive. So we had to, people have to be careful in that when they're in that situation. Lucky for us, we had guidance. My sister, who's a therapist, is the one that sent us in one direction. She obviously was not going to be our therapist, but she guided us where we should go. Mm-hmm. And from then on, we started getting book after book after book. I don't remember. We lost count how many books we read in that first month.
We ate, slept, and drank books.
Yeah, pretty much. And this was all about about these issues. And she was reading one book, I was reading the other. We finished it and we just exchanged it. And then we went to the next one. So it was a very, it was a difficult time, but I think it just speaks to our motivation to make this work. And from then we started to notice some other changes in our lives. One of the things that I did notice is that I could see some of the boundary issues that my patients have in general, and how that affected them, how it affected their health. For example, boundaries around proper food, proper eating, or having a spouse who drinks or smokes, and having proper boundaries around that, and how that affected their health. That was really eye-opening. So one of the things we went to therapy one weekend. Talking to our therapist, I told her, look, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing this, and that. And that explains why in research, in medical research, we see this, and that. Anyway, I'm making the long story very short. We hopefully can talk about those things more specifically in future podcasts. But I went ahead and traveled to Arizona for training under Pia Melody, who is the world's, at least many people do consider her the world's foremost authority on boundaries. And by extension in relationships, although you can make other arguments about that.
She's authored a lot of books too.
Yeah, she's authored books, but mainly she was a clinical director at the Meadows in Arizona up until recently. So I did training under her, and then we did some training with Pia on boundary workshops. So we would go with other couples and we sit down with her and we practice boundaries and go over boundaries. And one of the things that we noticed was that many of the other couples were always struggling just to get past even just talking about the toothpaste. They couldn't get past what to do about putting the cap on the toothpaste. They were so stuck on the toothpaste, they couldn't get past it. And we had done so much work by then that we were able to not only put the cap on the toothpaste, but we moved on to the hairbrush and the makeup on my side of the sink. And then we moved on to more difficult topics that when you're in therapy, you want to keep them light so you can get through the principles. The principles of boundaries around simple issues are transferable to more complicated issues. So if you can master the simple ones, when the tough ones come up,
like finances,
that's a big one. Sex, children, those are big ones. And then, the boundaries in a divorced couple, and they're not a couple anymore, but where the parents are divorced and having proper boundaries around excess. That is, that is so hard to navigate. Yeah. Don't even know where to begin. But if you're able to learn the simple ones and work your way up from there, it gets easier over time. But it took us years to get to that point. And also, what motivated us? What really motivated us more than anything is not just staying together, but our children. Because one of the things that we realized as we were studying all this is we learn our boundary systems from our families, from our family of origin. And if we come from a dysfunctional family, we're going to take those dysfunctional boundaries into the next relationship. Yeah. And that's a problem. And the thing is, this is something that a lot of people don't believe when they start this. But we are not attracted, dysfunctional people are not attracted to healthy people in terms of the boundary system.
And healthy people aren't attracted to dysfunction.
No, healthy people don't want anything to do with us dysfunctional people.
Icky. It's interesting how you might have been attracted to one person that may be completely boundaryless with flirting and stuff like that, but then as you go through this process, they're just kind of icky and slimy.
Yeah, and so, and that's a problem also that we've seen, is that if both members of the coupleship or the couple are not working together and just one of them is, then the relationship becomes very difficult.
Yeah.
And one of two things will happen is the person that's getting healthier will end up leaving the relationship and leaving the other one behind, or they decide, this is too painful, I'm not gonna get better, I'm just gonna stay dysfunctional and remain in the chaos.
Yeah.
And that's some of the saddest situations that we have seen.
But the most miraculous is when they decide, and I've seen this too, where, one person's working really hard on their boundaries and suddenly, the other person feels abandoned and they're like, well, what is she doing that I'm not? And so then suddenly they start getting serious about their boundaries and getting help and figuring out, how am I going to make this relationship work? So oftentimes, that person, and it usually was females in my situation that I was coaching or counseling, as they're getting better, their spouse is suddenly after a while starting, well, how do I catch up? Those are beautiful. I love seeing those kind of.
Those are the nice moments.
Yes,
and
they
we
are.
saw. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of those, but they are, when they do happen, they're wonderful to see. And I think from our standpoint, because it helps when you have another couple coaching you. But for example, if I'm by myself coaching another man, and his wife is not interested in participating, that's really hard.
Yeah.
That's really, really hard. When you're able to coach the female, and I'm able to coach the male, then they come together, and that works pretty well. So that's the beauty of this, and that's where we started doing the 12-step programs for couples, the Recovering Couples Anonymous or Anonymous.
Animals.
Recovering Couples Anonymous or RCA. And that was a wonderful program, and I still, that is a wonderful program. And we do encourage, if anybody who is looking to get better with their spouse or partner, to seek these RCA groups, because they're available everywhere. They're available online as well, and they can provide you with some support.
Just
especially
Google them and
yes, Google RCA, Recovering Couples Anonymous. So that we're trying not to get too much into detail. We're trying to give you just an overview of things. I think there was, so one thing about boundaries that we realized, one of the sacraments, Christian sacraments, is marriage. And so we realized that boundaries is an important part of spiritual growth. And we want to maybe just talk a little bit about that.
That's surprising and miraculous at the same time. One of the most miraculous things that, the healing of our marriage, obviously, something that I thought was doomed and could never heal, but it did. There's so many more that I could share. But, so that's really, that does that answer your question on that?
Yeah, and that's those are important examples of how this happens, because what we're trying to understand is how to find God in relationships. And this is one example. First we find it in ours, and then in our extended family, and in our children, etc. And some of the issues with boundaries is that they force us to express love or those limits in a loving way. That's number one. Number two, it forces us to walk in this path of truth. And that is a big deal, because only God knows what the truth is, what the absolute truth is. Like that truth with a capital T, that's God. So when we're practicing boundaries, we're forced to walk that path of truth. And that is where we start seeing, at least from an explanation standpoint, how that works. And then that's more of an experiential description that you provided there. So
can I say one thing? Boundaries is such a spiritual thing, but a lot of people have been traumatized in various institutions. So regardless of your feelings of religion, however you define something higher than yourself, you'll hear us say a lot of times higher power. And so and you don't have to be necessarily Christian to know how to set boundaries. You can be Hindu, you can be, you can identify God as the universe or spirit, Allah, Jewish, it doesn't matter. It's about, connecting to something bigger than yourself, because you really do see things that you just can't explain. They're unworldly when you start setting boundaries, things that you would never think in a million years could happen.
And when you say unworldly, you mean?
Miraculous.
Okay. So let's, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the spiritual aspects of boundaries as the podcast moves forward in other episodes. Today we just don't have the time for that. So what about some myths? You want to talk about some myths?
Yeah. So again, it seems like boundaries have become a trend. Like people use psychological language, but they don't really know what it means. So they think that they're setting boundaries when they're actually setting walls, not letting people in. Boundaries are supposed to be more like a fence, like a picket fence, where, you can see, if you want to see your neighbor and kind of stand up over the fence and say hi, you can do that. But in the meantime, if you want to be behind your fence and have some privacy, you have that privacy. So that's kind of how boundaries are supposed to be. But if you've got a moat and you've got a wall, you're isolating yourself. So we've also heard, at our business, when we would try to teach boundaries to our employees, oh, well, it seems like boundaries are mean, or I feel like a bully, or it feels like it's against my religion, but these are huge myths. When you really get into them, you learn that they're about protecting other people, not just protecting yourself. It's not a selfish thing to set boundaries on other people, because it's such a relief to know where other people stand. I'm sure you have been in a situation where a friend comes over or a family member and you're trying to decide where to go to eat. And you say, okay, so where do you want to go eat? And they say, I don't care. And so you're like, no, really, you can pick. It's your birthday. No, I don't care. You can pick. And so you go back and forth, and it's really kind of uncomfortable and frustrating. But when you know that, okay, well, if this person isn't going to set their boundaries, I'm going to set my boundaries, they are relieved. Let me tell you, because somebody took the lead and set their boundaries. And so, and it's the same thing with children. When you've heard of those children that act out to get your attention because they're not getting boundaries set on them. So people, it really is, in the 16 years I've been setting boundaries with people, you see this sigh of relief, like, oh, finally somebody made a decision. So
on that note,
yeah,
I'm going to make a decision and set a boundary here in our podcast because we can go on for a while and we got to wrap this up, at least for this episode. So what are some of the things that our viewers, our listeners can look forward to other than talking more about Trinity?
Yeah. Hey. So we have 10 more topics that are coming up. Really, we have 100, but we'll just give you the next 10 topics that we have already developed. The next topic, we're going to go much more in depth. We're going to define what boundaries really are.
And that's going to be more of a lecture.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a lecture, and hopefully you'll get a clear picture of boundaries.
Yes. Self-care. Boundaries are huge around self-care. I used to really burn the candle at both ends before, recovery. And I was a stay-at-home mom, but I was more busy as a stay-at-home mom than when I was a realtor working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I couldn't say no to anybody. And, people think, oh, she's a stay-at-home mom. She can join the PTO. Oh, she's a stay-at-home mom. She can bring snacks for basketball. So it's about self-care. And then our family of origin and how that affects our boundaries. We're going to go into our emotional reality. Sometimes we have, it's basically, our perception of things, and acknowledging that other people may have a different perception, and how to navigate your boundaries around that. Boundaries and shame. Boundaries are very closely tied to shame, and many of us come from a family of origin.
Or to clarify, the inability to set boundaries.
Yes, exactly. And when we come from a family of origin of shame, we often have a hard time setting those boundaries. And we're ashamed to do it, basically. In the Western culture, shame is a way of controlling your kids. So we've grown up with shame, most of us, our whole lives. Attachment theory. Dr. Pocurull is going to go in depth into that very heavy subject. That's about how we learn to, can you explain that a little bit?
I think it's, when we say very heavy, it's going to be more towards couples, work, and relationships, but and how this relates in our family of origin, how we relate to our parents, how we attach to our caregivers. That's how that works, and
then we transfer that attachment to our
partners and our children.
Mm-hmm. And then addiction. Addiction is close, it's all about boundaries. And then codependence, which is the opposite of addiction. It's the partner of addiction. And then relationships, my favorite subject on boundaries. So it'll be fun.
And just so you'll know, your first lesson on boundaries is that interrupting is a major boundary violation. And unfortunately, we are both guilty of that, and we have to be careful. At least in here, we have the excuse that we have to interrupt each other for the sake of time. But that is something we'll be talking about. What I was trying to say in a long-winded way is that going over lists and types of boundary violations, that will be one of our other episodes as well. There are a lot of boundary violations that people don't even realize. Oh my gosh, that's a boundary violation. You know what my favorite was when talking to Pia is farting in an elevator.
Ew.
That is awful.
Oh my gosh.
But of course everybody thinks it's hilarious. But that is a boundary violation.
Yeah,
so
it is.
Next time you're in an elevator. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be seeing you soon for our follow-up episode. And do us a favor. If you like the information here, like and follow us. And tell your friends.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.